All right. Welcome. We're here to talk about Intune Policy Playbook for MSPs. Just going to cover some basic topics like baselines, some hardening settings, and real-world setup scenarios. Uh,
Let me jump
yeah.
into just some typical maintenance stuff here. Let me see. Attendees are still loading. And I just want to touch on we are recording. That will definitely be sent out afterwards as well. I can see people are still loading here. Main two maintenance things here. We love when you use the chat. Keep things busy. That's awesome. Banter and everything in the chat. And if you want to ask questions as we go along, we'll be happy to try and answer them whenever it's pertinent. Um, please use a Q&A for any of the questions so we can track that they've been answered or get back to you with answers. And then let's just keep the fun stuff in the chat. I'd love to do a quick intro as well. So Asai has been with us for a couple months now. He's a new member on our team. Hopefully, you guys have had the pleasure, or some of you have had the pleasure to speak with him, part of our support team, and always happy to assist. But he's got a lot of experience, which he'll jump in shortly. So over to you, Sai.
Yeah. Some background for myself. I have over 12 years of experience in the MSP department, working with various MSPs, various types of clients. And then the last 4 years or so, I've been focusing a lot more on the cybersecurity aspect of that. Like Robbie was saying, I've joined Augmentt back in November. Pretty happy here. And in my personal time, I enjoy board games and escape rooms. Uh, that being said, let's get into it. So, a couple things on the agenda here. We're going to go over some basic licensing and setup you need to get started with Intune, just to hit the ground running. Some compliance settings and ways you can enforce that through Intune, configuration settings, deployment scenarios of applications, and how you would configure conditional access after you've configured Intune. And then we'll open the floor for questions. So let's get started with licensing. So to get started with Intune, to unlock the feature in your portal, you need to have an Intune Plan 1 license as a minimum. Those are included with some of those licenses here we have on the left-hand side. Um, you can get as a standalone as well if you'd like to. It's just bundled in with these ones, so we have it listed here for convenience. What that gets you is the basic features of Intune, so cross-platform endpoint management, some build point endpoint security, mobile application management, endpoint analytics, Microsoft Configuration Manager. We'll jump into what more of those means. Are kind of like just complicated things of saying ways to manage your device. And so, addition to those, you can, if you want to, upgrade to Intune Suite or Intune Plan 2. We won't really cover that too much today. Those are more advanced topics. But those give you additional features such as additional privilege management, app management, some advanced analytics, and you can get remote help. Some of those are also available in the Tune Plan 1 as additional cost add-ons. So that's a feature you can look into if you'd like to. All right. Before we get into the setup here, I do want to kind of go over some groups or organizational settings. So when you're setting up Intune policies and configuration, you want to kind of really get the architecture out, the layout of the land. The best way to do that is groups. So it's good when you're planning as an SP especially to have standard naming conventions. Me specifically, I was like kind of in charge of Intune for some MSPs I was at, and I know what's going on when I'm creating the groups. I want to make sure it's really plainly labeled so that anyone else stepping in or any like because there's always sometimes overlapping IT that is clearly labeled. So coming up with a naming convention that's standard and then creating that naming convention as a practice, documenting it is ideal. Some common ones I do like Intune underscore base. And then you can obviously you can dissect that even further by going into departments. So maybe you have like a legal department or a development department. So you can Intune underscore development, Intune underscore legal. That way you can break up the policies based on your different requirements on different departments and such. You can also have for locations. Intune can be deployed to either users or devices. There's a standalone Intune device license as well if you want an environment where you're going to have like dedicated devices or kiosk devices. The user licensing is included in the ones I mentioned before. Those are more applicable for like if you have licenses for users that are using multiple devices or could log into different devices. It's the more common use case. Then when you have groups, there's going to be nesting practices, of course. So just some things to look out for. Nesting is good for compliance and configuration policies. Like I mentioned, we have Intune base, and we'll get into some of those compliance and configuration policies later. But typically, what I do is I'll apply the baseline configuration policies to that one, and then I'll nest other groups, like maybe like legal departments or development departments underneath that one. That way, those subgroups will get those configuration or compliance policies. The catch is if you're deploying applications with groups, they don't nest well. So you could deploy an application to a nested group, but it won't deploy to further nested groups down, if that makes sense. I guess the example is if you have Intune base and Intune development, and you have like, I don't know, SQL that you want to deploy. If you deploy it to Intune base and you have Intune underscore development, it will not get the application deployment. If you deploy the application to Intune SQL or Intune developer, then they will get the deployment. So it goes down, but it won't go upstream. It's kind of confusing, but it makes sense once you get more familiar with the process. And then dynamic groups. Um, we won't touch too much on dynamic groups today, but optimally, that's kind of the best way to organize groups where you can. If you have, like, for example, we mentioned departments and you have group names, you could have Intune groups specified to department names, and you can have dynamic groups to key off that department name to get that automatic association. It really helps with preventing the stale like permissions where you have one person who maybe switches between departments, but they still have all these other applications. By utilizing dynamic groups, you can kind of stigma that and just kind of get it more cleaned so you're not having to do so much cleanup process.
So I'll jump in here. Someone asked, says, never too sure whether to use device groups or user groups, and which one for compliance or configuration policies apply to devices or users. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It really depends on your environment and the licensing. So the default Intune Plan 1 is a user-based license. In that case, I use user compliance policies. The device configuration policies or device groups typically apply for like if you have non-user specific devices, like let's say you have a fleet of loaner laptops or tablets that need to go out, but they're not designated to one specific user. In that sense, oops, in that sense, you will want to use a device configuration policy. And there's also kiosk machines which are not assigned to a specific user, so you want to use a device specific group. Otherwise, if you're using the standard Intune Plan 1 and you have users that are like switching between devices, user policy is going to be the most strict one. That way it's tracking your users. Some use cases are that really come in handy with compliance policies is enforcing, like, for example, SOC 2 compliance. I had a client who they had 50 or 60 users and just about as many devices, a handful more, and they had to get SOC 2 compliant, which meant they had to standardize their encryption standards, their antivirus standards, their like screen lockout, their admin rights. And so they had contacted a company who were gonna like run a script on each machine, which would take about 15 to 30 minutes, which is a lot. But then the problem is they needed still admin rights for their developers to test applications, so there'd be a lot of drift that happened. We proposed Intune, and that's where the user policies were reinforced because they had developers switching between devices. We did have a small subset of kiosk devices, like they had these test designated machines that people could just check out. So that would be a good use case for device group. But utilizing Intune in this scenario ended up saving them a ton of time and headache. We were able to, like, we'll get into enforce configuration compliance policies to meet those standards for SOC 2. Because we had user-based licensing or assigned, we can generate reports that shows the users are assigned to the group. They have these policies assigned, so it meets the compliance standards. And we can generate reports for when those aren't when they fall out of compliance, we can see that and then get notified and remediate as needed. Um, Big time saver. And then the application stuff was there's some application settings where you can have and empower the users to reinstall devices applications that you specify and force out applications that you want. So that's a huge win as well. Hope that
Thank you.
answered your question. Cool. So we've talked about getting the licensing, we've talked about setting up groups. Now, if you want to step into, the next thing you have to do is do your domain verification and autopilot setup. So domain verification, in order to have Intune to work with your tenant, you need to have these CNAME records. These are the standard ones Microsoft has. So no matter what your tenant's name is, that's going to be these same CNAME records in their domain name records, DNS records. So just two CNAME records here. And then I'll show you where you go do that in the admin portal here shortly. And then I'll go to the autopilot setup. So I'll switch to that now. Moment. Okay. So if you log into your admin portal, which I've logged in here to our test environment, the way you would set up the domain verification, once you've had the Intune licensing applied, you go to settings, domains, you select the domain that you're trying to apply to. Um, you navigate to DNS records, and you would get an example of those same DNS records that I mentioned before. In this case, we've already added them, so the status is okay. If they weren't okay, you would go here and you'd verify them. And I'll show you where else you can verify the domain. So once you've added the domains to your DNS, you would then navigate to Intune. If you just applied an Intune license, sometimes this could take a few minutes to load up to an hour to propagate to your tenant. So just keep that in mind. When you navigate to devices, you go to Windows, enrollment. You can also do a CNAME validation here. You type in the domain, you test, and it makes sure that the CNAMEs are registered and correct. In the same window here is where we're going to set up autopilot. So you go to automatic enrollment, and you configure how you want this set up. Typically, my best practice recommendation is when you're first setting up Intune is to limit it to a specified group. You get to choose a group. And then when you feel comfortable with it, it's good to just open it up to all. But depending on your environment, that might not be the best use case either. So it's up to you. You would just go here, select the groups, and select the groups as well. You can have more than one group as needed. Once you have that set up, the next step for autopilot is going back to Windows enrollment. We have to set up the deployment profile. You would select deployment profile, and you can create a profile, Windows PC. Just do demo. You can choose whether you want to convert all target devices to autopilot. What that means is you can hover over here for more information. But basically, if that machine were to get wiped and it goes to out-of-box experience, if it's an autopilot assignment, it'll go back through the Intune enrollment. So typically that's what we want in most environments. In some cases you don't if you have a BYOD situation. It's up to your discretion. Then here you're going to choose what the experience is when they get the out-of-box experience. That's when they first turn on the laptop, or if you wipe the machine and start it up, it'll show you like what's going to happen. You can have user-driven. If you know the device is going to be assigned to a specific individual, this is typically what you want because then the user has to credentialize, they have to sign into their account. It'll assign the device to them and assign any profiles or policies to them as needed. You can also have self-deploying, where it'll just automatically roll it in Intune, and then you have to deploy it to a standard user after. You'll see some of these options are grayed out because it just kind of does it all in the background when it's doing the process. User interface can kind of choose how you want it. Standard or administrator account. I'll get into that here in a second as well. And you can apply device naming template. If you want to have a naming template for your computers, you can. There are some cool keys you can use, like for example, serial number if you want to have a serial number name, or random characters. So you just put like, that would make the computer name be test dash and then the serial number of the computer. Uh, it's up to you how you want to do it, up to 15 characters. Uh, by default, when you enroll a device in Intune, if you're enrolling it not out of box experience, the user enrolling the device will have administrator rights to the computer. That was a big gotcha back in the day, and then Microsoft finally released an option to call that. I'll show you here. So if you go to, this is also like some setup you want to do ahead of time just to avoid the headache of then removing administrators. You would go to here, navigate to Entra ID, go to devices, you go device settings, and then here you get to choose which users can enroll in Entra. By default, set to all. Maybe you're testing, you don't want everyone to enroll. You can choose to selected group or selected members. You can choose if you want to have them require MFA to enroll devices to Entra. Best security would be to turn it on, which they also specify here. Um, by default, the number of devices a user can register is 50. I've only seen this come up when we've had scenarios where some IT help desks, one person will use their account to register all the devices initially and then divide it up to people. So this could be a problem, in which case you might want to set it to unlimited. Typically, if you're having the user self-enroll, less is better, just so you don't have someone getting exploited and registering a bunch of devices to your tenant. Um, Here we have the options of setting the global admin role as a local administrator. So your 365 global admins will have local admin rights if it's on by default, which it is. And then, as I mentioned, registering users added as a local administrator device during the Entra join. So by default, that's set to all. You can choose none, which means no one will be registered. That's best practice, in my opinion. You can choose selected if you know there's specific help desk people that are going to need admin rights. Uh, Best practice is typically you don't want a local admin as the main user account, in my opinion. And you can choose to manage additional local administrators. So like this is where you would be set this to none, and you know you have specific help desk people. You can choose this to create like a group, let's say help desk group, and you assign people to the group. Those users would then have admin rights on devices. It's a good way to manage that. But yeah, and then other settings you can have for devices as well here. So once you've configured those settings, you're going to enroll your devices. Typically, what you want to do is configure compliance. So compliance is going to be the main thing that we talked about earlier, where if I'm in if I'm in an environment where I'm managing Intune, I want to set kind of like the goal marks of what I'm measuring against for compliance. So it's kind of typical to go into it. My best practice is, like I mentioned, is you start with a top group of like what your basic requirements are for compliance, which in my opinion should be like, firewall, encryption, some sort of antivirus. So let's go through what that looks like here, setting that up. You got a
Hey,
device?
I'm trying to find a good interruption point for a question here.
Sure.
I think now might be it. So we were in the initial setup, and someone asked what the difference was between the MDM and the WIP uh, in the last slide. Was
Oh,
that during the
let me get
onboarding
back to
basics?
there. Yeah, that would be under here.
You have a good flow here, so I'm having a hard time finding the right spot for the questions.
Yeah, this is basically just the WIP isn't really I haven't used it too much. I think it's a limited use scope here of if you have to like it's information protection. Like if you have to have specific type of legal agreements with your employee, you can kind of like link them here. So if like you have some advanced scenario where like, hey, using this device or like you have to meet these requirements, you can insert that here. Like you can say like in addition to the basic requirements, like you need to also comply with these policies and terms and agreements, and you can link that URL here so they get that notification when they're enrolling the device.
So when they're going through the typical setup, they almost get like a custom EULA or something like that.
Correct. Yeah.
Awesome. And then what about the MDM portion?
This is the default. So MDM is kind of like same thing. It's like the terms of use for the URL. Like Microsoft has its own. You can modify and make your own MDM terms of use, and you can modify that URL to be your URL. Discovery URL is typically going to be these are default. In some cases, you might have a hybrid environment and you have a different link. That's where that comes up for the discovery and compliance URL. Yeah, you might have a different like system that's managing your compliance instead of Intune. You can specify that here. It's like third-party applications and stuff. But by default, I never really have to mess with these.
Okay. And then there's another question I think I've got here. So someone asked if all of these settings can be configured in a template within Augmentt. And so Augmentt won't, and we'll run through Augmentt at the end of this, right? As always, we like to kind of give you the real value add, how you use Intune without the marketing stuff. And at the end, if you want to stick around, we'll show you how Augmentt can help with some of that. The steps that were went through of initially setting up the Intune environment itself are not currently covered in Augmentt, but we will show you how some of the steps about to go through, which is how you configure your best practices for your device configuration policies, compliance, and so on, is where Augmentt will be able to come in and save you a ton of time and help standardize. So we'll cover that near the end.
Yeah, cool. All right. Any other questions pending before I step on to the
I think I
compliance?
saw a hand go up, but there's no question in the chat, so I think you're good to go.
Okay. Yeah. So compliance policies. This kind of ties back to I mentioned the SOC 2 compliance thing that I went through. A lot of different compliance. It kind of saves you a lot of time in the long run of tracking down when you have big environments of like what's going wrong. So we'll start with the like I mentioned, in my opinion, the BitLocker, Defender, and Firewall are kind of the main settings. You can have any number of policies. You can bundle them. So what I have here, I'll just kind of show you how you make one. You can create a policy. You can select a platform. In our case, it's going to be Windows 10 and later, and it's a compliance policy. So they have templates, um, and then they have the Windows 10 11 compliance policy. The templates are stuff you can create and kind of modify Windows. Let's just do a demo. And then here you get all the settings you can have for compliance. So these are all the things you can measure against for compliance. You can choose custom if you want to, if you have a script that you'd like to use. I haven't used that personally. Typically, I just go for these ones. BitLocker, Secure Boot. I want to make sure those are enabled. You can choose a minimum OS version if you want. You can kind of go through all these settings and choose them as you want. I'll kind of show you what ours looks like just to skip the rigmarole here. Ba-da-ba. Yeah. So here I've selected all the settings that I think are pretty applicable. And then I'll show you what it looks like when we go through the process. So after you set the settings, you can then choose the actions for non-compliance. So you've chosen the settings that are required for you to be compliant. Now, what happens if you don't meet those settings? So by default, Microsoft has it'll immediately mark the device as non-compliant. So if for some reason the drive is not encrypted and it tries to like it will try to remediate if you have a setting in to remediate it, which means encrypt the device, it'll mark it as non-compliant. You can choose additional settings, like maybe send an email to the user, like, hey, your device is not compliant. So it'll have a template you can choose from. By default, there's this basic one. It doesn't have a lot of information. It just says your device is not compliant. You can choose to make and modify some templates if you'd like to, but these are kind of basic ones. So you have to select template, and then you can choose if you want additional recipients. This is kind of key. Typically, my recommendation is you probably have a help desk distribution list or some sort of ticketing system. You just chug that in there. Um, there's also an option to add device to retire list. Maybe you have devices that are going stale and need to be cycled out, so you can have it like, after 90 days. It'll get added to the retire list. Because the email thing could be after 14. You can specify the days and stuff. Typically, I would not recommend emailing right away because stuff will follow compliance, especially if you're just enforcing it and it has to do remediation. I'd give it some time before you have to send the email notification. Yeah, and I'll show you where those go after. You can kind of run a report on those, and I'll circle back to that here in a second. But yeah, this is the main settings. You can kind of get an overview of it once you've created the profile. We have firewalls required encryption, we require antivirus, require a TPM chip, making sure Defender is up to date, and then real-time protection is enabled. Additional settings are like minimum password length, blocking simple passwords, making sure you actually need a password to unlock the device as opposed to like just automatic unlock. And then maximum number of minutes of inactivity for password required. There's additional settings. So that's like just checking to see if it's setting. It's important to remember this is not actually like making these settings. It's not configuring the settings. It's just checking to see if these settings are in place. And that's where we go to configuration policies.
So before you jump ahead, hopefully I'm not throwing you a curveball, but you've got minimum password length as an example. So from your understanding, how does that work when this is a device configuration, but user passwords can also be configured are configured at the user level?
Yeah, so this is kind of like so Intune is kind of like a amalgamation of like Active Directory. So what would happen is like there's an Active Directory like a registry entry gets put in the computer to make sure there's a minimum password length. Some things can supersede that, like if you have um your Microsoft password, because it's synced, it may not be the same requirement, but any local password is going to check to make sure there's a minimum length requirement.
Gotcha.
Um, if it doesn't meet the requirement, it'll typically enforce. Like if you try to set a password that's less than that, the computer itself has that registry entry in, so it won't let you set that. It'll like throw up an error saying, does not meet the minimum requirements.
So any local admin accounts trying to set it up would require the 14. If there's a previous one maybe configured, then it would fail compliance, for example.
Correct. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool. All right. And then yeah, so switching, we set the compliance, which is, in my opinion, the goalpost that we're trying to meet. And then we now go to configuration policies to configure those devices to meet that compliance standard. So similar to compliance policy, we create a policy here to meet those settings. You can bundle them, like I mentioned, like we did before. You can also separate them. There's some benefit to separating certain policies, just in case you want to like modify, be more granular with permissions. Um, but I have
So you
here,
can work on like an additive model where you just keep adding pieces together and they form your complete policy depending on the tier of service, the vertical, so on.
yeah. So we can have like, for example, BitLocker. I've created a separate policy for it. So it's going to be our encryption standard. So we know in the previous policy we require encryption. This is going to be how we enforce encryption. And I'll show you real quick how you make it, and then I'll go into it. So you would create a new policy, select Windows 10 and later. You would go to Settings Catalog. It's important to note this used to be an admin template. They've retired that and moved to Settings Catalog, which is more granular. There may be some environments that you manage that have admin templates still in play because they're created before this change. You're not able to create new ones anymore. So, demo, just gonna go through it here. You can add settings and you can choose from a subset here. So this is like all the settings you can choose from to manage the configuration. Uh, in our case, we're going to go ahead and make a bundle one for our environment. So we know we need BitLocker. So you select BitLocker, it shows you all the settings you can choose. If you want, you can just select all, and I'll show you can kind of detract or subtract as you go. We'll go BitLocker, we're going to go Defender for antivirus, and then we're going to go Firewall for our firewall settings. So we've selected all these. We can kind of now go through the left-hand side and we can kind of choose like, do we want to warn for other disk encryptions? Yeah. You can choose whether you want to, you can go through all these settings, which is great. You can choose to exclude removable drives from encryption if you want to. You can choose not to, depends on the environment. Um, Require device encryption step what we want. Um, and yeah, you can kind of go through all these settings. There's a lot to go through. So you just kind of set it once and then it'll just kind of enforce as a policy. I'll show you our existing one so we don't have to go through this. Um,
And I guess the way to go through this is either experience, right? You know what settings you want, or to follow some set compliance standard, CIS, NIS2, so on and so forth.
yeah, yeah. So typically you either have a standard for your environment, and if you don't, like you can refer to like what I do is like I do CIS V8 is what I kind of like go to as my standard. Um, but yeah, I mean, and then Windows will have some, like they will warn you about like some of their best practice recommendations of like, what to do or what not to do. Um, so we have some settings here. In this case, we are choosing to encrypt data drives. So that's like if we have a computer that has multiple drives in it, that's a data drive. So like your standard operating system's your C drive, maybe you have a D and E drive. Your environment may or may not require those to be encrypted as well. So that's up to you guys to decide. Some cool settings that you can have in here with BitLocker is you can, allow standard user encryption. This is important because if we've gone through and made it so that the standard user has no more admin rights, we want to allow them to be able to encrypt the device without admin rights. So we enable this setting. Require device encryption is important. Um, some cool features is configure storage of BitLocker key information to Azure directory services. So that means the BitLocker key will get synced to your directory or Microsoft Enter ID or Intune, so that you can pull the key from the Intune policy, which is nice and helpful if they ever get stuck in that recovery screen. Um, and we kind of go through and do the same thing. The firewall is probably one of the more complicated setups to do. Again, it depends on your configuration. Um, there's a lot of variables you can go into here. But yeah, there's some default settings that end up, Microsoft will have best practice. You can choose whether to configure it or not. Some things you might want to change are the log max file size. Maybe you want more logged files. Maybe you want less, depending on like your configuration settings or your user hard drive spaces. You'll be more familiar with that. Um, yeah. So you choose that, you set it up. The more important thing is once you set up a policy, well, let's probably go through that part here. Like we had talked about before, you're gonna have groups. We talked about an Intune-based group. So once you set up a policy, just choose one here. Uh, for assignments, you want to go ahead and add the groups that you want that assigned to. So my recommendation is if you have like a base policy, all your devices need, but there's required standard, you make a top level Intune group like Intune_base. You apply these baseline compliance settings to that group, and then it'll kind of like it will trickle down. So if you wanted to add like a developer group or department group, you make it as a member of the Intune_base. So you have nested groups, which I said before. It's good for compliance and configuration policies. Those do trickle down. Applications do not. So that's the main caveat to keep in mind. But for this stuff, it's good to have a top level base. That way you're not having to redo these settings or adding a ton of groups here. You can just have like the one group added and then make all the other groups a subset of that group. Um, yeah. So configuration policies, you kind of go through all those things. You make those configuration policies. Um, they're pretty standard. They're kind of and then if you ever need documentation, learn.microsoft.com is my go-to. They have it very well documented there, and sometimes their best practices as well. Um, so we've created compliance policies, we've created configuration policies, we've pushed out to our devices by nature of adding it to the groups. We now want to know, okay, we're checking in like how many devices are compliant. So first of all, if you go to devices, by default, it'll show you in the main page if they're compliant or not. But if you have like hundreds of devices, it's not really tenable to go here. You can filter, but it's not ideal. So you can go to devices, compliance, see your policies. There is a report section here, which is probably more useful. You can go device compliance. You can have a summary report, which will give you a top, like just a quick summary. And you have to hit generate. This doesn't automatically populate. You have to generate it to manually pull the data. It can take some time depending on like how big your environment is. But if you go to reports, you can choose what kind of report you want. Let's say device compliance. Similarly, you have to generate a report and it'll show you a list here. You can choose if you want compliance status all, or maybe you only want to see the not compliant devices. You can choose what OS you want. You can kind of filter it down, and then you can export this to a CSV. This is super helpful to kind of tracking down, like if you want to know why a device isn't compliant, you can just go to the device itself. You click on it and you go to device compliance. It'll show you which policy it's not meeting. You can have multiple compliance policies applied to one device. You click on the policy, it'll show you where it messed up. In this case, the encryption of data storage on device is not met. That gives you action items to follow up. Maybe in some cases, we get in situations like with BitLocker encryption, the computer didn't have TPM requirement. And so we had to actually swap the physical drive to meet that compliance. It really depends on the settings you set. But it really helps because if it falls out of compliance at some point, like maybe they swap the drives and it doesn't get encrypted, then it gets you that big flag with the email alert or in this reporting. And let's see, covered that. Some cool other policies that you can have with configuration, like we just touched the compliance meeting, but there's a lot of settings you can have here. Like one common one that I run into, like I mentioned, SOC 2 compliance. One of the requirements is to have like the inactivity timer, and it is also one of our compliance policies is to make sure that's 15 minutes or less. And so that would be Windows 10 or later. You go settings catalog, hit create. We'll do screen inactivity timer, add setting. You can just search to, I think that will show up if I'm not mistaken. Device lock. Yeah. So you can choose both. I prefer to be more thorough by choosing all the settings, but this is deprecated. So essentially, device password enabled, we'll do enabled, max inactivity time lock. This one's in minutes. And then same thing. So it just shows after 15 minutes, it's going to lock out. You can obviously choose less if you want to. We do have a policy for this. That's screensaver. Is that the one? No. Um, I was going to point out there's a weird. Oh, that's Mac. Okay, hold on. Screen activity. There's one weird setting. I think it's no longer available, but it might be local security policies. So if you can do it multiple places, right? This is the one we just went over. There's also local policy security options to do interactive login, machine inactivity time limit. Uh, it's weird, but this one is actually in seconds. It doesn't quite say it. So if you click here, and this is a lot of places you can kind of click, and there's actually it'll link you to an article to give you more information explaining the feature. So here it goes into, okay, this specific time, here are the different commands you can do. Here's like the registry entry it puts in. And then here it shows these are the value methods allowed, inactivity time in seconds. So it's good to note that they aren't always uniform. Like even though it's minutes here, it's seconds here. And when in doubt, hover over the eye, click learn more. It'll take you to that learn.microsoft.com and it has very verbose information. That's a lot of what I've used to figure out some of these templates. And I'll go into some other fun use cases if we don't have any questions about the configurations for compliance settings.
I think, let me see here if this one is, I think the question we have are better suited for towards the end.
Okay, that's good. All right, so I mentioned the device security, the screen activity timer, that's a good one. There's a couple other ones. Like if you like the point is like if you have a setting you want to apply, like I've had it where power settings, like maybe you want wake on LAN enabled, you can do that the same way. New policy, Windows 10 or later, settings catalog. That's going to be your main bread and butter for all the stuff you can choose from the drop down. Um, One use case I've run into a lot is a lot of environments have started to use like OneDrive sync and SharePoint sync more commonly. And so there are these settings you can use to enforce OneDrive, which is nice. I'll just go into our existing one. It's similarly, you would do a settings catalog. You would select OneDrive and you select the options from the side. So here you can choose a lot of things that like will cut down a lot of the user time. Like one, you can choose you can prevent users from like let's say you want them to only have their files synced to OneDrive, not locally on their PC, excuse me. This will prevent users, they won't be able to change it back to their PC. This setting here, silently move Windows known folders to OneDrive. You get to choose which settings, which folders. By default, Microsoft wants desktop documents and pictures as their best case scenario. You don't really want to sync downloads. That really gets kind of messy and bloated. You can choose whether to notify users that happens or not. If they do get notified, the pop-up basically shows like a little thing saying your IT has helped, secure your files since they'll be backed up on OneDrive. You can limit this to a tenant ID. This is handy because let's say you want only your tenant to be specified as the OneDrive sync. You don't want them syncing their personal OneDrive or another company's OneDrive to their folders and then backing up your company files to their OneDrive. So you need your tenant ID, which you can get from Entra ID. You go to entra.microsoft.com and you go to Overview. You have your tenant ID here. You just copy that value, you paste it in there, and that's how you would specify that tenant specifically. This is a duplicative. This is kind of the same. So like if you decide, oh, you know what, these are the same thing, I don't need this one, you can just kind of remove it. This one here, you can silently have it sync. So obviously, if you're using Intune, more likely than not, it's going to be tied to the Microsoft account, which is also their OneDrive account. So they have a setting to just automatically sign them into OneDrive with their Windows credentials. This might not work if you're in a situation where you're hybrid and their Windows credentials are like an AD on-prem and their credentials don't sync to 365. That could cause issues. But if they are synced and if they are the same, then that's a great setting to have. It just skips the whole sign-in process. Similarly, like this here will automatically start OneDrive when they sign in. That makes it so users don't have to like think about it. It just like runs in the background. It's kind of like less of a headache for them. Files on demand, this setting, again, you can hover over here if you want to know more. But essentially, it'll only keep local files if they're actively using it. After a period of inactivity, it'll just kind of like delete the local file and keep it synced to 365. That will prevent your hard drive space from getting completely bloated if you're syncing a huge OneDrive thing and doesn't meet the hard drive requirements. You can also warn users if they're low on disk space, and you can specify how much space that is. This is in megabytes, so 5,000 megabytes with 5 gigs. In this scenario, you can customize that to be what you want. Similarly as before, you would then, choose a group that you assign this to. In our case, you can choose the Intune base, or maybe you only want a certain department to have OneDrive folder. Maybe you only have licensing for a certain department. You can choose that specific subfolder that it would still get the compliance policies if it's a member of Intune base, and they would get this policy as well. Um, this has been a big time saver. Similarly, with that one client I had who had a SOC 2 compliance requirement, we used a similar profile to back up all their files, and it made it easier for people who were switching from devices. Their devices, like I had one person who they like their laptop fell out the window. I don't know why they were using it while they were driving, but it fell out the window and they were out of a laptop. So we were able to hot ship them a laptop that was Intune joined. They signed in, they got all their files. As soon as they signed in, Intune pulled down all the applications they needed, all the profiles they needed, and because OneDrive had all their files, they were up and running right away. Very low IT overhead. Just had to ship the laptop, which is a huge time saver for sure, and big relief for them. And so that ties us into software deployment, which is a big uh, add-on, saving a lot of time with deployments and configurations of machines. We would go to apps, Windows, and then here you can choose which apps to deploy. They were a passenger for what it's worth. It's not me to question how they're using their laptop, but I don't know. I would have personally just enjoyed the ride. Uh, yeah, so here there's many different kind of applications. We won't cover them all today, just for timing, but the most common application you want to deploy is going to be your 365 apps. So you can thankfully do it pretty quickly through Intune. You can choose Windows 10 and later, 365 apps. You can choose to rename it if you want to. I think the other one's just a bit long. Um, the featured app, it's part of the company portal, which I'll touch a little bit, but we won't get too into it this session, just for timing. So here's the main thing is you get to configure the suite. So if you want, you can do XML data. The default is configuration designer. You get to choose which apps to deploy. Um, I've had it where in a scenario, most people like at a company, they no one there use Access, no one there use Publisher. So I just unselected those, like no point in having applications that aren't needed. There was a problem though. A year later, they hired someone that needed Publisher. So this is a good caveat to have. I had an IT person who was not familiar with Intune. this one person needed publisher, but this apps was deployed to all of corporate. And so they're like, oh, I'll just select publisher from here and then save it. The problem is because of the way the app suite is deployed, it actually just reinstalls Office with the publisher add-on. So it ended up being a disruption for a lot of people. So just keep that in mind. That's why I kind of go into the baking up the groups is really key here because maybe you do need someone that needs publisher. Maybe not now, maybe down the road. But if you have it subsetted, like, okay, it's only going to affect 10 users, it's a lot easier. Or you can do an exceptions and add the person, which is it gets messy. The point is, if you're going to make changes to this application list, understand it will affect basically it's going to reinstall the whole Office suite to add or remove any of these applications. So be thorough when you're considering that. Um, Default file format, it's up to you what you want to use. I use OpenXML. And then update channel. So uh, best practice is like it depends on how you want your appetite for updates. Like semi-annual enterprise channel is going to be the least disruptive to your clients because there won't be a lot of big feature updates that are in place. If there are new features in place, though, had it where this is our standard, so we don't have to get too many disruptions. If there were big changes from Microsoft that could break things, that's kind of like it's kind of smoothed out by then. The problem is like if there's a latest feature, like, oh, this month we have this new feature in the application, they won't get that. It only updates twice a year. So in that sense, you would want to do the monthly enterprise channel if you want to be more up to date. Just keep in mind, the more frequently it updates, we've seen it before. Microsoft sometimes releases something that just breaks something else. That's been a caveat of having that. That's what led me to the semi-enterprise channel as being my standard. You can choose to remove other versions. That's important if like, they have maybe a 32-bit version, you want to install the 64-bit version. Maybe you need to have 32-bit for some reason. You can choose if you want specific versions or latest version. Latest version seems to make most sense. Shared computer activation. This is important if you have like I mentioned, a shared environment. If people are hopping from computer to computer, it's pretty nice to have that enabled. Just makes it easier. You can have it automatically accept the EULA on their behalf of the user, which makes sense. They're already kind of enrolled, so they've already kind of accepted a lot of the policies it needed. I don't really care much for Bing, so you can choose to opt out of that if you want to. It's up to you. And then languages you can choose if you want to select a language. If you don't select a language, by default, it's just going to do whatever the system language is. Yeah.
Just if Microsoft is listening, we don't opt out of that.
Yeah. And then this is a key part here. So like I mentioned, you can assign it to a group. We can choose a group that we created like Intune Base or Intune Corporate or Intune Development, whatever subset we want to. There's these other options too, available for enrolled devices. So the company portal I mentioned, which we won't get into too much, you can deploy a company portal. It's kind of like it's a custom app store that you get to control which applications are available. Applications that are in there, the end user can install or uninstall as they see fit. So if you make it available for enrolled devices, it will show up in the company portal. One problem I've run into is if you have a device that is required for deployment, required means it'll automatically push that application to the device. Like as soon as it syncs in, it's going to push it down. If you have it as required and available, it will not push it down automatically. So it requires manual intervention. The user will have to go in and opt in to install it. It will still show as required, so they might show up as non-compliant if they don't have that software installed, but it won't push automatically. So that was a good gotcha that got me a couple times. So optional applications, kind of nice to have available from real devices, but if you absolutely have to have it, required only is ideal. And then if you want uninstall, I've done this for before, like we've had like the McAfee add-on that gets pushed from devices. I've done like an uninstall command, like I had just a whole application thing just to uninstall that. And so that's something else you can do as well if you'd like to.
Awesome. I think we have a question on this one too.
Sure.
So if my users already have O365 apps on their devices and these app policies override, do these app policies override the existing apps, and will it upgrade if necessary?
Yes, it will overwrite. So like I mentioned, that setting is controlled through the where was it here? Remove other versions. So if it'll just basically act as like an update, like it'll just uninstall it and then install this version. And then if it's the same version already, it's just gonna kind of overtake the settings and then enforce these settings on top of it. if there's settings that are here, like if you had access on that before and you don't want access, it's going to do that reinstall thing. It's not super disruptive for the reinstall. It tries to be kind of tactful about it, but it could be user interruption for someone who like doesn't turn off their computer ever. But it will overwrite.
Awesome. I think we're right on time for today, so this is great. I'll take over the sharing so we can jump into the Augmentt demo. And there's actually a lot of questions about what Augmentt can do as well.
Sure.
And I will call out here that we're doing a multi-series on this. So we started with what we would consider are the basics of Intune. We will be diving deeper into different portions of Intune. And of course, feel free to add more questions around that so that we can help fine tune the presentation to what you're interested in. Let's see here. Of course, it hides everything when I do that. Try to pull up some of the questions and answer them as we go. But generally speaking, there's been a few questions being popping up, such as, does Augmentt help with any of these out-of-box best practices? So obviously, Augmentt is a tool that helps manage and secure your M365 environment. We've had alerting, security posture, conditional access forever. We released Intune late last year. Intune has a ton of out-of-box recommendations. So if you're trying to set this up yourself for maybe one of the first times and you're trying to learn everything that Sai has went through, we do offer out-of-box recommendations that are based on best practices, including, as I mentioned, CIS 8 that you can simply take and roll with. So you'll do that kind of initial setup where you do your CNAME and kind of set up the Intune environment, and then your policies you can leverage our out-of-box baselines and start duplicating that across customers for super easy onboarding. Um, if you have a set of baselines today that you like, that you're trying to replicate and standardize across customers, just like you can with our conditional access stuff, you can template them in Augmentt, simply pull them in. So pull in existing configuration or compliance policies you have from any of your existing tenants, right? And just load them and save them in Augmentt. I'll not save another one here. And then these can then be built into baselines within Augmentt. So for example, I have a baseline here of two different policies, right? And this is how you can easily do what I was talking about, which is um, create the independent policies so that they can be stacked rather than overlapping within themselves, but then roll them out as a baseline so that essentially one click rolls them out to your customer base consistently. This can also help you with instead of having to manage many tenants as the sort of a golden tenant, uh, store different policies in Augmentt, put them together in different kinds of baselines for your tier one customer, tier two customer, your uh, fintech, et cetera, kind of vertical, right? And then simply have all the variations you need to roll out. This is true for our conditional access, for our Defender, for our Intune. Um, and then with that, if you need assistance, right, being an Augmentt customer, we're able to help you. You can call our support, get assistance on some of the configurations, the settings, etc. We've had a question over here for you, Sai, as well. So what has been your experience with passkeys and passwordless MFA rollouts being the more recommended security precaution these days, but regulatory compliance standards still mandating password change? And it's interesting because, yeah, Microsoft has certainly been on the train for use a single password, don't rotate passwords, but we've definitely seen some standards that are finally catching up. I think NIST finally caught up, but for quite some time, they were requiring password rotations. Have you dealt with this at all, Sai?
Yeah, I mean, I've dealt with big problem with passwords is like there's so many exploit methods with passwords nowadays. There's, the man in the middle attack, there's like just screen what's it called type loggers. So like there've been a lot of methods to kind of like circumvent that, like using a PIN or biometrics to kind of like avoid that. So Microsoft new practices passwordless is better. Just because you don't have to put that password in, it just keeps it secret, right? There are some caveats to it. you typically like you want like some of the requirements are having a secure device. If you're using a passwordless method on an unsecure network or unsecure device, and it's not that much more secure, you're just kind of like giving that token or key away to whoever's observing that. So typically like passwords are, that's your main encryption like unlock to the session. So like those extra methods, kind of like MFA, they're like extra keys in place. So those passwordless methods just kind of give you protect your password a little bit more, which is nice. But you want to make
Yep,
sure
I
all the
guess
prereqs are in place.
yeah, if the business you're dealing with is tied to a certain standard model and it doesn't follow best practice, I mean, all you can do is fight against their model, but in the end, you may end up setting up password rotation and cringe about it, and maybe add passwordless on top of it. But yeah, it's a bit hard to fight sometimes with those standards.
Yeah, one of the
There,
problems with password rotation is end up people inevitably just like just keep the same password and just add on to it or like start writing down the passwords, which is why Microsoft
yeah,
recommend the avoid.
exclamation at pound
Yeah.
dollar. Yeah, I know. I'll put
Yeah.
myself back in the corner. Um, Been there, done that. So one question that came up is, can we deploy third-party applications such as RMM? And the answer is yes.
Yes.
Uh, you have to package them. It can be tedious. You can run additional third-party apps. So these are things you can do in Intune. I think they are things we may even cover in future sessions if there's interest. These are not things we do yet in Augmentt, but we are planning on adding capabilities for your existing scripts and apps to be replicated and pushed out as policies across your customer, which should aid in this. So those are things on the roadmap, absolutely. Someone said, what do we need to add Intune and Augmentt? Oh, well, that's easy. So just contact your rep, reach out to support, and we'll get someone to call you, whichever way you want. But yep, just reach out and we can get that enabled for you. In fact, tomorrow's the release day. I mentioned this, I believe, on the last partner webinar. If you don't have Intune will be re-added for everyone tomorrow on the internal NFR, so that you can at least play with it. And then, of course, if you want it across all your customers, reach out to your sales rep. Um, so how does Augmentt interact with Intune? Is there some sort of link you enable through the Augmentt site to allow it access to the Intune portals? Nope, just reach out to your rep and we can turn it on for you. And then we just start seeing the data. Let us see. I think there were a couple more questions up here. Would like to see more BYOD policies. Um, I would presume you're asking for out-of-box policies. Uh, we will absolutely, we're getting a lot of requests for iOS MDM, and I think that's what we need to build those BYOD policies. So definitely coming. Any additional questions here? Can we have links to the next sessions? Sure, our marketing team is listening. I'm pretty sure we'll be passing that around. Um, Oh, someone has replied. The Intune webinars are set up. Oh, Levi replied, I should say, that the Intune webinars are set up as a three-part series, so you're all registered automatically. You'll get the additional webinars for those. But feel free to send us questions. Again, my email is robbie.brisson@augmentt.com. If there's any specifics you would like to get covered in those webinars, we're happy to take suggestions as well. Of course, put them in the Q&A or the chat as well. That would be awesome. Let's see. Can we edit Intune policies in Augmentt? So that will come. Um, Not currently. If you've seen our product before, you know you can do this in conditional access. So what we're doing right now is we're building out all the different policies. You can use the Intune UI that Sai was just walking through to build out your initial policy, right? Kind of a one-time go through the pain of doing it in Microsoft, and then you import it in Augmentt and you can use it across customers. So that's the current method that allows you replication and standardization. We will eventually be adding the ability to edit all those policies. So that you can make, on the fly edits to your customers, on the fly edits to your templates, and propagate those. So that's definitely in the works. If you're wondering how that'll work, just look at our conditional access stuff where you can do all this today.
Oh,
Um, and I did want to add as well. So what Sai covered on, well, like a in a large topic, two very particular things, right? Your device configurations, which you can do and replicate through Intune, setting the compliance policies, which you can do through Augmentt's Intune. And then one thing that we touched on is going through the reports to see which devices are compliant or not. Um, we also have integration for device compliance. So devices requiring compliances, devices no longer being compliant. And so you can also be notified on the fly so that you're not constantly having to go back to Intune to run those reports, to find out what devices need help, what customer you need to nudge, so on and so forth. So you can get all those notifications automatically through your PSA, get them sorted, and get them handled that way as well. So a little bit of a set up the configuration and monitor that configuration. I think we are right up on time. I think definitely want to give you guys the opportunity for any additional questions if they come in. Other than that, I want to thank everyone for their time, and we'll see you in sessions 2 and 3.
Yeah. I saw a question about, is it possible to have several templates for different scenarios? Yes, you can have different templates, different configuration or compliance policies, and you can have different groups assigned to. Um, Definitely. And
Amazing.
yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Have yourself a great day. We'll see you in the next ones.
Thank you.
Bye.